Good morning. We are going to go ahead and get started, and I will continue letting people in as we get settled in this morning. My name is Jill Elwood. I am the Nonprofit Programming and Relations Manager at the One Valley Community Foundation, where our mission is to connect people who care to causes that matter to build a better community here in Gallatin County, Montana. We are so excited to have you joining today for our December Nonprofit Cafe session. I was just telling our speaker, Meshayla, this is the biggest group of registrants we have had for Nonprofit Cafe since I started my job. So thank you for joining today. That obviously means that this topic is resonating with all of you. We're so grateful to Meshayla for taking the time today to chat with you all and share her expertise. Before we dive in, we have just a couple of announcements, and then we'll get started on today's presentation. Sorry, I keep looking to my right. I'm just letting people in from the waiting room. I want to start out by thanking our headline sponsor, First Security Bank. They have sponsored Nonprofit Cafe for years, and they are the reason that this program is free to all of you. So big thank you to them for continuing to support this program. I also just want to mention, although we've been doing this for years, if you could keep yourselves muted while Meshayla is speaking, we greatly appreciate it. There will be multiple opportunities for engagement, and at that time, she will give you some instructions on whether we are jumping in breakout rooms or what we're doing. If at any point during this presentation you have questions or there's anything I can do to support you, I will be monitoring the chat today, so feel free to chat me directly. Additionally, when we do go into breakout sessions, if for some reason you're in like a shared space or a public space and you can't jump on, we hope you'll still stay in the session and you can just stay in the main room with me. I do also want to mention that we have a handful of people joining today. This happens every now and then with our online sessions. We have a handful of people joining today from outside of our community here in Montana. So welcome back to our regulars, and to those of you tuning in from afar, thank you for joining, and we're excited to have you here as well. I am going to introduce Meshayla and turn it over to her, and she will then ask all of you to introduce yourselves. But first, I want to introduce our speaker. Meshayla Cox is the founder and principal consultant of CoEquity Consulting. For nearly a decade, Meshayla has been a fierce advocate for racial equity here in Montana, and she is committed to supporting company cultures that nurture and value the inherent dignity of every person. She's educated over 1,700 people in the private and public sectors, from philanthropy to technology to conservation. She's given workshops and trainings across the nation, including as a TEDx speaker. So imagine my absolute delight when she signed up to volunteer to share her knowledge and expertise with the nonprofit sector here in Gallatin County. It is because of the generosity of our speakers and their willingness to volunteer our time that this program is possible. So huge, huge, huge thanks to Meshayla for sharing her time and expertise with all of you today. And with that being said, I am going to turn it over to her to lead today's session.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jill. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Meshayla Cox, and I use the pronouns she and her. And if you do not have your pronouns in your Zoom name, I would love for you to go in and add those. If you hover over your face, you'll see 3 blue dots in the top right corner. And then you'll have the option to rename yourself there. I just want to make sure that I'm using the appropriate pronouns when I'm referencing you or speaking with you throughout our session today. For our first intro, just as like a welcome, get to know each other, and we'll do something a little bit more in depth in a moment. I would love for you to share in the chat your name, your pronouns, which of course should be in your Zoom name as well, the organization you're affiliated with, and your role. And we'll just use it as a way for everyone in space together today to get to know one another. As you saw in the blurb for this session, we're going to be talking about anti-racism, and specifically anti-racism as a missing focus in our larger diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We'll talk through a shared understanding. We will identify at the end steps in an organizational anti-racism transformation process. We'll also talk about ways that we can put ideas and beliefs of equity and justice into action. To start us off, I'm going to walk through just what we'll be running through today, which you received in the agenda beforehand. So We are working through our welcome, our intros. We're going to work through a self-assessment. Would love for you to also take this assessment. It can be adapted in a lot of different ways, but measurement is really one of the key components of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism work. So we have a point to measure ourselves against and see how we are progressing or moving forward. We're going to unpack some myths about DEI and anti-racism in organization. Then we're going to talk about moving past feel-good DEI into actual organizational changes. That'll flow us into how do we actually become an anti-racist organization, and what are the different pieces of an organizational structure do we need to be paying attention to. Before we dive in, because we'll be doing some group work, I do want to lead with some group agreements. Let me know what we're missing. If you have group agreements that you love, please share them in the chat and we will incorporate those into our day. But just to run through these quickly, make space, take space. So this is step up, stand back, be aware of if you're more extroverted and making room for quieter voices. What is set, our play on the Vegas rules, what is said here stays here, but what is learned here leaves here. Protect people's confidentiality and whatever folks share with you personally in session today, but also, and then you can take forward the lessons that you learn. Embrace mindful silence. So you might see me trying my best to lean into the uncomfort that can sometimes be silence. Lean into discomfort and accountability. Receive feedback as a gift. Meaningful participation matters. We're going to assume the best intention, but we will absolutely name the impact. Also, permission to speak in rough drafts and not have to sound smart. Give me your sloppy copy. We're all learning, and we're learning new information, and we're in a new group of folks today. So no need to be the smartest in the room. Recognize and honor the experiences of people of color and other minoritized folks. Again, let me know what we're missing. Feel free to drop those in the chat. I am really excited to kind of introduce myself to you all a little bit more, and I'm using the frame of a radically human introduction. And this was actually introduced to me by someone who's on the call today, and it is my absolute favorite way to share pieces about myself. What it really does is it serves as a way for us to share about ourselves outside of our professional qualifications. What brings me into this work? And what makes me an expert outside of some pieces of paper I have or what I list on a resume. So, but let's get those out of the way. So I attended the University of Montana and pursued my degrees in Spanish and African American Studies. Through that time, I did a lot of organizing, anti-racist educational sessions for community members, and also leading the Black Solidarity Summit, which if you're ever looking for a way to support Black students in Montana, BSS, Black Solidarity Summit, is a great way to do that. I worked at the YWCA, and this is when I really started to get interested in impacting systems to support organizations' missions out in the world. I then moved to Bozeman and took a role with the Montana Racial Equity Project. During that time, I explored dismantling or changing white nationalism throughout the state of Montana with Western State Center. In 2020, much like a lot of organizations, kind of the national consciousness was raised. And with that, a lot of organizations started to center anti-racism if they were already doing DEI or starting on their DEI journeys. I went and pursued certification through Cornell University as an advanced diversity and inclusion professional. And eventually, years later, after I actually applied for it, went and spoke at TEDx Bozeman, speaking about Black experiences in the state of Montana from historically to currently. So I am not only an expert because of some of the qualifications I shared, but also because of my lived experience. I have to always have a special mention to my Nana. That's my best friend. That's my ace bukush. We're like this. And where she was the most impactful, which is in so many different ways in my life, she was the first person to give me the sit down talk at around the age of 6 in understanding my positionality in the world as a Black woman. And this is a Black woman sharing this with her granddaughter, who is also an immigrant to the United States. So she was kind of missing some of the understanding of systems within the United States and how that impacted me. So I kind of grew up with this understanding of more individual racism more than placing it within a system. But something that she always taught me, she is a God-fearing woman, is always taught me to seek justice in little ways throughout my life, to always take perspective, to lead with love, and to lead with grace. So this has instilled values in me that, of course, led me into the social work field and justice field. I really think of a couple quotes when I think of my Nana and some of the values that she instilled in me. And one is from Alice Walker, which is, activism is my rent for living on the planet. So my Nana always taught me that we always need to give back, whether it's the shirt on our back or offering extra resources that we have, we always support one another. And Cornell West, who says, justice is what love looks like in public. And I think that there are a lot of little ways that my Nana really sought justice in her life and supporting most vulnerable and most marginalized folks around us in all the ways. I didn't end up in African American studies or leading work for the Black Solidarity Summit by accident. I ended up there because I needed the language to name my experiences and the impacts of racism on my family, and to try to support younger students as they were managing the university system and other systems in their life. This led me to continue working with communities of color in a variety of ways. One of those ways is with Earth Tone outside Montana. They're a local Montana nonprofit local to Bozeman, and they focus on getting people of color in the outdoors. I've gone ski, what is it called? How can I not remember it now? Whatever. I've done a lot of things that I would never have done otherwise. Snowshoeing and all of these things. I'm originally from California. I couldn't imagine playing in the mountains, and they give me that opportunity. And then, of course, most recently, sharing my knowledge, expertise, and experiences through speaking engagements like this and like TEDx. This passion eventually led me to creating my own consulting company, which is CoEquity Consulting. And I like to think of CoEquity as your co-conspirator in your personal and professional anti-racist transformation. So focusing on how the personal impacts the professional and vice versa, and how we can strengthen values within you internally and within your organization to support historically marginalized communities. I want to progress anti-racism within an organization that protects and values all historically marginalized groups and positions employees in a place where they can better serve the mission of the organization when they're well taken care of. So just a little bit about myself. These are just a few elements from my life that provide a context of experiences and the perspectives that I bring into my work. Recognizing this, I can really identify what I don't bring, which gives me direction in engaging with others, in advancing my knowledge and understanding where I can do really well and where I can learn from others. On that, I would like to know, in thinking about the personal to professional, I would love to know a little bit about your team. So you shared kind of your names, your role, your organization. So in thinking about the folks that you work with, how would you describe them? So simply describe your team in one word. Now, this might be difficult, but please try it in one word. That's the challenge. If you had to sum up your team in one word, what would it be? And I'm still with y'all. Similar to what Jill shared, I got a dual screen. It lets me see the chat a little clearly, and I can still see all your pretty faces. I love this. Thoughtful, creative, passionate, committed, respectful, caring, intentional, yes, learning, unique, amazing, caring, dedicated, awesome. All of these are wonderful, and a lot of ways that we would probably inherently think to describe nonprofits, right? We come to nonprofits with a sense of justice and a sense of service to our communities. This is wonderful because I think that nonprofits are a great place to really implement thoughtful and strategic anti-racism change. All of these values that you are describing within your team create a great foundation for a group of folks to progress diversity, equity, and inclusion within your org. as we think about, I mentioned measurement and how important measurement is, and I'll continue to talk about measurement. We're going to lean into this personal reflection. So I'm going to ask you to first take a minute if you need to kind of journal to yourself or kind of think through the options we have here. Where would you plot yourself on this spectrum? We have a spectrum of one, I would rather not talk about equity and inequity, or I am usually uncomfortable talking about it, but maybe if someone else is talking about it, I could be around it. I am sometimes uncomfortable talking about equity and inequity. Maybe it starts to get into places where you don't feel as competent. Maybe talking about LGBT plus rights feels comfortable, but then when we start talking about race and racism, maybe you kind of bow out of that conversation. Or I am usually comfortable talking about equity and inequity. It's not usually a problem for me. Oh, I'm very comfortable talking about equity and inequity, or I talk about this in my day-to-day life. So what we're going to do is an annotation feature. So if you look at the top of your screens, there's a little green bar, and you should have a drop-down menu that gives you the option to annotate. And then once you're in there, you can choose whatever stamp suits your fancy and plot yourself on this self-reflection chart. Which one do you identify with the most? Okay, so we're heavy. Yeah, I would be a little shocked if we were on a 1, but heavily on the 4 and 5 with some outliers on 6. Oh, great. So
Could you
while,
say again where that button is? I'm not finding it.
yes, absolutely. So at the top of your screen, you should have a little green bar. And if there should be a pull down menu, and from there you can choose annotate. Looks like we got a rogue star up at the top. Awesome. So it looks like folks are heavily on the 3 to 4 range, like some outliers into 5 and 6. What I am curious about for folks is what barriers prohibit you from advancing to the next tier? And if you're on the furthest spot on the spectrum, maybe considering how you can strengthen your racial equity knowledge and build more allies and bring more people along with you towards a 6. So I'm just going to have you take the next couple minutes and do a quick journal to yourself, and then we'll come back and chat as a full group. What barriers prohibit you from advancing to the next tier? Or if you're at the farthest spot on the spectrum, consider how you can strengthen your racial equity knowledge, or what you might need to bring folks along with you to the 6th tier. So again, just a couple minutes to journal to yourself, and then we'll talk as a full group. So I'll bring us back at 9:21. Great, just another minute. Great, so just bringing folks back to the front of their screens. I would love just a couple folks to come off mute and maybe share. Maybe we'll take 2 shares for what barriers prohibit you from advancing to the next tier. Who would like to share with the group?
I can share.
Yeah, thank you.
I think living in places like Montana, I grew up in Colorado. It's sometimes a lack of like proximity and exposures to different races. Just I think we don't have a ton of diversity, or we do have a lot, but it's compared to other places. I think that's one thing that I've experienced.
Okay, yeah, awesome. Thank you. And we're going to come back to that comment in the future. So we'll hold on to that. Don't really have that much diversity in Montana. Not a lot of opportunity to talk about this. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Anna. Okay, maybe one more share on what prohibits you. Keegan, I saw your hand raised, or was that an accident?
Well, so I was going to say that I think it's easiest for me to talk frankly about sort of inequity in a lot of different frames when it's with people I'm very close to or when it's with strangers. But there's this weird window of sort of acquaintance where there's this social expectation, like Thanksgiving drinks with the so-and-sos on this side of town or whatever. And that, for whatever reason, I haven't figured out how to be as frank and as direct in that kind of setting for some reason.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So who would like to share, if you plotted yourself maybe 5 to 6, why, how can you strengthen your racial equity knowledge? And maybe I'm throwing a curveball in here, but also maybe some perspective for folks who were wondering about how to get to the next tier on what helped you progress to the farther end of this spectrum. What tools or resources felt really valuable for you? Quincy, yeah.
Hello. I was going to say one of the big things that I've been pushing for in my organization is building money for racial equity training directly into our budget. And I think that's something that would really help me continue to build and bring more people along as allies. And something that's really helped me in feeling comfortable saying I'm at that top tier is really embracing fear and embracing discomfort and embracing the fact that you're going to argue with people when you have these conversations and trying to get comfortable in that space, even if it makes you nervous, even if it's uncomfortable, even if, you go back to your office and you're like, why did I say that? Now I'm going to argue with so-and-so about this. But I think that can be a really valuable space as well.
Great, thanks for that perspective, Quincy. And then Kiva, did I say that correctly?
Hey, pretty close. It's Keva.
Keva, okay.
Yeah, just to be irritating. But
no, it's your name. We'll say it correctly.
I appreciate that. So I'm with Park County Community Foundation over here in Livingston. I grew up in Livingston and I graduated from Park High and left just as quickly as I could get out of town and spent most of my adult life in Dallas, Texas, working in the nonprofit and education advocacy space there. So to that curveball that you threw us a little bit about how did we sort of get to this point of being comfortable about it? I had the really wonderful opportunity in Dallas many years ago to be trained in equity and inclusivity. It was called some different stuff back then, but we were dealing with a lot of urban school districts and we had to understand and center the people that we were serving. So I feel like I was really blessed with that opportunity. And that's where I learned to be more comfortable talking about it. That and also my activity in the LGBTQ community there in Dallas. So it provided sort of a free space for me to learn about all of that stuff, learn about myself and how I fit into that as a privileged white person who also is part of a marginalized group. It was a really wonderful experience. So I feel like what I've learned in those places has sort of boiled it all down to 2 things for me. One, I have to keep learning from people like you who are gracious enough to share your lived experience with us. And secondly, I have to remember that I am not here as the expert. I'm here as a conduit of awareness, you know, to just be willing to say what I believe in, what I have learned, and hope that that makes an impact.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Keva. And we're going to talk a little bit later also about that centering of people of color. We'll talk more in depth about accountability and what does it look like to thoughtfully center people of color within your organizational representation, employee representation, and externally with the community and accountability to communities of color and other marginalized groups. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I'm going to clear our screen with all our beautiful drawings, and we're going to move into the next piece. When I thought about coming into this session, I was most curious about what are some of the myths, the barriers, the challenges, kind of some of the narratives that can deeply impact your ability to progress equity, anti-racism, justice within your organization or within a group that you are a part of. And so in that thought, I'm curious, what are common DEI and anti-racism myths you've encountered in your work? So I'll just ask you to journal to yourself and then share in the chat, maybe a couple myths, if you could share it in just a sentence or two. Oh, that's weird. Okay. Ooh, so Faye shared, it's not our core mission, so why do we need to focus on it? Yes, Faye, you guys, y'all are just teeing me up for my future slides. Like, I love this for me. The myth that anti-racism is somehow trying to vilify everyone else. Yep, not seeing the connection for themselves personally in the mission of anti-racism. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Additional thoughts? It needs to come from yes, y'all, it needs to come from human resources, that an organization only has one chance at doing anti-racism correctly, that it's an event rather than a process. Oh, that's a really good point. I already know, I'm already aware, I don't need to do the work or continue education around this. No, I've already achieved the ultimate Thanos level of equity. I've got it. I've got all the rings of equity and diversity and inclusion. Like, I'm done. Yeah. It's not nearly as bad as it used to be. So why do you care so much? Is anyone relating to some of these in the chat? And if you relate to any, I personally love the term retweet. So I bring Twitter with me everywhere. When someone says something, I'm like, retweet. Yes, absolutely in agreement. Or you can add plus marks in the chat if you just see things and you want to affirm folks and some of the myths that they're sharing in the chat, or continuously throughout our session, use retweets, thumbs up. You can give plus signs to just show people that you are in agreement with what they're sharing in the chat. It's safer to stay away from this topic. There's just too much to learn. Plus, think of the backlash we will get. Thanks, Luis. Absolutely. Bridget, the myth that there is an end to doing this work or a final destination rather than the importance of continual learning, failing, growing, and trying again. Absolutely, which ties into some of the other myths that folks shared. So I think our next slide will get into a good bit of these myths, and then we'll kind of circle back on some that maybe I'm not able to touch on or that I don't have on my list. Oh, it's too political to teach kids. Brittany, that's amazing. I don't have it here, but it's like something that I always think to touch on. We don't have many people of color in Montana. So like racism isn't an issue. We don't really need to talk about diversity here. We don't even have diversity in this space. First, this equates DEI work with, first, it equates like DEI and anti-racism work with needing those identities to be in the room. As if we are thinking about how do we shift the core of racism, right, which is white supremacy, white power, white control, white dominance, then there are conversations that can and should be happening with or without a brown face in the room. And that racism exists as a perpetuation of white control, power, and superiority over people of color. So people of color being present does not mean that that's the only time that there's racism, right? That racism is perpetuated in all ways, at all times, with or without me or any other person of color being in the room. I also think when people are thinking of this in terms of recruitment or hiring, I worked at the Montana Racial Equity Project for about 3 years. And in that time, there was never a shortage of people of color to hire from. And that was due to the representation, of course, the core of the work, but because anti-racism was a core mission of the organization, and there was representation within the organization and externally displayed values that aligned with people of color and how they wanted to be treated and served within their workplace, one of the places they spend most of their time. So kind of this myth around that we don't have enough to hire, you need to have that alignment with your mission and your values, and folks will come. Build it and they will come. We'll get into this a little bit. This is why starting and stopping with diversity is extremely problematic. And we'll kind of talk more about that in a minute. Unconscious bias trainings are the foundation of DEI and anti-racism work. We did implicit bias trainings. We do them every year. Like, this is a good start, isn't it? Like, we've done the work. You want to really focus on bringing anti-racism through all areas of your organization. Programs is of course important, trainings is of course important, but we need to go way farther than implicit or unconscious bias, which perpetuates the idea that it is only an individual's personal work to dismantle racism, when we know that racism is inherently a systemic oppression. DEI should live under HR only. I have another note when we're thinking about trainings that is really, really important. And we'll talk more about having a trained, of course, anti-racist team. This might be your DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, JEDI, IDEA, whatever you call yourselves, maybe a team that would need to be trained specifically in anti-racism. Recognizing that in historically white dominant structures, white people should be the risk takers on these issues. And one of those risks is putting yourself out there to really engage in deeper anti-racism work. And this was named earlier, but make sure that the time and money are set aside for anti-racism trainings, right? Make sure that you are institutionalizing your efforts for new and existing staff and volunteers and board members as well. So not just a training for the DEI, but how do you integrate these trainings so it's throughout all areas of your organization? Okay, of course. Yes, Angelina, I just saw your comment. Another myth is that hiring BIPOC staff, Black, Indigenous, people of color, resolves any issues, right? That's that start and stop with diversity. The idea that what that leads to is people of color needing to assimilate into white dominant culture structures, whether that is things like having to wear certain clothing, straighten your hair, ways that we have to assimilate, or feeling tokenized, right? Now we have our DEI representation. I couldn't tell you how many like flyers I was on for University of Montana because I had a lot of like friends of color or gay friends, and they were like just the poster board of diversity for UM. And to this day, they still use photos they got from our Instagram. So the idea that like that resolved all that we needed to, we have the diversity, it's here. Can't you see on our website? The idea that DEI should live under HR only. So when we're thinking about that team that I identified, your diversity, equity, inclusion team, your team of change makers, of folks who want to make that change within your organization, should be representatives from all areas of your organization, from different departments, from different leadership statuses, and it should especially include your CEO, your president, your executive director as a part of that group as well. You need someone who has that decision-making power. human resources employees should absolutely have a role on that committee. It is a very valuable and crucial role, but it should not solely live under HR. This is a process that should be deeply integrated throughout all areas of business. It is not a separate addition to your mission. It should be fully integrated as a core piece of your mission. And then I kind of went into DEI or anti-racism. It's like the separate organizational strategy that kind of goes in the same idea that it should be fully integrated. That we are more alike than we are different. We just have to stop looking at our differences and focus on our commonalities. And people just need to learn to talk to each other. That's the problem. The reality is that while it might seem obvious, long-term inclusivity is the goal. Diversity is the healthy result of achieving effective and ongoing inclusivity. In other words, diversity only thrives in an inclusive environment. So we want to start with equity and inclusion. Starting and stopping with diversity does not get us closer to any sustainable or transformational change within an organization. Diversity will be the natural results of having equity, inclusion, and justice within your organization. Brittany shared in the chat that it's too political to teach kids. Of course, inherently, we as humans tend to bring our politics into our views. They impact our views, and of course that comes into the workplace. But I want us to also think about this in terms of the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, EEOC. That is like a literal policy, but we don't perceive that as being a political standpoint, right? It protects employees' rights against harassment, retaliation within the protected classes. But when you talk about equity within this practice, we name it as political. I think inclusion is only political if you practice exclusive politics. Then we need to talk about inclusion, but it is not inherently political or not linked to politics. It's linked to our values. It's a focus on our basic life principles. It's how we understand and treat people who are different from ourselves, right? So we want to use these principles to shape a healthier culture that enhances collaboration and productivity and builds innovation and has better opportunities for everyone by centering those who are most marginalized. They're not political values, they're human values. I have been, of course, talking a lot about how core anti-racism work is to DEI. And I want to actually go to this next slide because I absolutely love this quote. I, in my work, start with race, and I intersectionally view systems of oppression within that context, within that analysis. In the United States, whiteness is the dominant privilege identity. It was colonially constructed to justify genocide, slavery, discrimination, and discriminatory laws and policies, both historically and currently, that disproportionately benefit folks with white skin tones at the expense of people with Black and brown skin. This is how ideology deeply impacts us as individuals. White supremacy, racism, it's the air that we breathe, it's the water all around us. And we can't examine or look at the barriers that prevent people of color from succeeding in a white male world without looking at what makes this a white male world, right? So even when we're looking at concepts of considering white male dominance in terms of gender, we still have to consider elements of race and how white supremacy impact this being a patriarchal society ran by white males. This is a good place where if you're starting out on your anti-racism journey, looking into the history of race, looking into Carl Linnaeus, Johann Blumenbach are some great places to start, and start to conceptualize where the creation of race started, who it was developed to serve, and how it deeply impacts our systems and our own personal perspectives to this day. I like to think of race, it's a myth, it's a colonial construct, and a social reality. It's developed racism and these categorizations of race were developed to center and serve white folks above all other races. When we get into talking about feel good DEI, this is why it is so important to name race and racism and be very clear about what we're talking about, because race, our end goal is to have equity, right? Our end goal is that we wouldn't have to see necessarily color, but the reality is that there are ideologies that have been perpetuated for hundreds and hundreds of years that have created disproportionate impacts for people of color. And of course, this doesn't stop at race. Cisgendered, able-bodied, heterosexuality are a list of other dominant privilege identities in which historically and currently laws and policies have operated to disproportionately privilege those that fall under those identities at the expense and direct harm and violence of others who do not. So another place where it's really crucial and important to examine your own personal story, your frame of reference. I named earlier in my Radically Human introduction how important it was for me to recognize the perspectives I was bringing and the perspectives I lacked, because it gave me an opportunity to interrogate my implicit biases. But of course, it is not sufficient to stop there. We have to continue the work and actualize that change. In the name of actualizing or institutionalizing anti-racism, a number one comment that Jill shared with me that folks were curious about is like, where the heck do we start? Where do we start? How do we move things forward? And as I was sitting with this, I think one of the core pieces is that we have a group of change makers who are united towards our common purpose. I named having them be trained in anti-racism, and a core piece of that, and this might be your DEIJ team, your JEDI, your IDEA, DIG, I don't care what you call it. It doesn't matter what you call it. What matters is that the people in that team have a common understanding of and a unified language, unified shared understanding of history and current context of systems of oppression, and that these are directly linked to the organizational mission. So in diving into the mission, what is really, really critical here in considering your identity and mission is to bring equity from the margins to the mission, right? So we want to think about how do we integrate anti-racism in a thoughtful and purposeful way. When we're thinking about a mission, what does a mission of an organization promote? This should be pretty easy. Anybody can hop off mute and just like yell it at me. Come on, what does your mission do for your organization? There's no sloppy
guides your practice, guides your action.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Thank you for that. It guides your practice. It guides your action. It helps shapes your organizational culture. Most importantly, right, it identifies what you hope to achieve in the future. Why do you exist? What are you going to do about it? What do you hope to achieve in the future? We want to think of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism as mission relevant, meaning that they are core to your organization's identity and mission, and not a separate thing that lives under the DEI team or lives under HR, but as something that is core to your organizational change and your organizational mission. We also want to create that alignment within the team and within your organization on DEI and anti-racism principles. Another important point here is that long-lasting anti-racism change is only as successful as the leadership is. So we heard earlier that teams were described as passionate and compassionate and caring, and that bringing that passion is really important in building that alignment and clarity for the rest of the organization. Something I see a lot of times, whether I'm doing an assessment or a training with an organization, is that largely staff are really confused about what they're doing or where they're going or what's going on. I do want to do a quick pause, and we're going to throw in the breakout group here, Jill. And we're going to break out into groups of 3. And what I'm really curious about you all talking about in your group, and considering just like the tease we have here about the whole table we're going to get into, where are you on your anti-racist journey within your organization? What are the biggest challenges you are facing, or what do you anticipate being the biggest challenge as you progress through this work? Great, thanks. Was anyone mid-sentence and they got like UFO'd back into the room? Yeah, it's always good to get an idea of like how much time or where we want to spend more time on the conversation. So I think with that in mind, where I'd like to start is maybe folks coming off mute and sharing where you're at in your organizational journey, some of what you talked about in your group, and some of the challenges that you're facing. As folks kind of come off mute and share affirmations, retweets, understanding if you relate to where someone's at, thumbs up, just engaging with the people who are brave enough to kind of come off mute and share their organizational experiences. So again, throwing the questions back at you, where are you in your journey? What are the biggest challenges you're facing? What do you anticipate being the biggest challenges in progressing anti-racism more explicitly within your organization?
In our group, we talked just about being non-BIPOC individuals and having organizations that are not very diverse, and about just kind of figuring out like, where do we even start and how do we, it's good to talk about race, it's good to talk about being anti-racist, but like, how do you implement that, and where does the responsibility lie, and in what ways? And then also just sort of the idea that as people who are white or dominant culture, that even that idea feels racist to say that dominant culture, just that idea that everybody's experience is different. So trying to not be racist in a way requires you to stereotype what it would be to be racist. So we were just totally like, trying to figure out what it is that we should do and how we should do it and how we should do it best. So we're all open in that group.
Yeah, thanks for volunteering yourself first, Nikki. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Before we kind of get into like if folks are having a similar experience in their organization, I'd wonder if we throw it back to the group for folks who are maybe further in their journey to reference what Nikki shared. Embracing mindful silence, embracing mindful silence, embracing mindful silence. So some of the core things I heard from Nikki sharing was kind of one of those myths we talked about earlier, right? Like there's not any people of color in the room. Should we be the ones doing it? Is focusing on naming white dominant power structures perpetuating racism. What are folks' responses to that? And then I thought there were some logistical questions as well, as like who's responsible, how do you integrate it?
I'm happy to share. I don't know how much farther I am in the journey, but we as an organization, we've definitely started. We're in the process, we're in the journey, and we're never going to finish the journey. So I don't really know what more to say than that. Like we have been doing trainings, we've been taking deep dives into personally who we are, as an organization, who we are, and we are an all-white organization. But one thing that we've done is start to change our board. Our board went from a male white dominated board to now we actually only have one male on it. We probably need to swing back. And it's majority people of color. And so we've really started, doing a dive there with the organization to help us understand. We've done a lot of trainings. And so even though we're a staff of all white people, I think it's okay for us, it's not like we need to hire somebody of color in order to start this journey. We've engaged in the trainings, we're taking a look, we're talking to people, and we're learning how we can be better. So I don't know if that, sorry, my son is home and he's 4 and he's really loud.
Oh, we don't apologize for being humans. Like, you're absolutely fine. That's not what I like to do in my Zoom rooms. We're all zooming in from different places and life is life. But thank you, Julie. I appreciate Julia or Julia. Okay. Thanks for sharing. I think that's a really important point that you named there, which is that equity is not a final destination, right? It's not a fixed state of being. You don't achieve equity competence and now you are the end all be all of all things equity or anti-racism. It's a lived value. It's something we're trying to live into at all times. You're always learning and growing and progressing and being a human and being messy and making mistakes and trying again. And that is it's kind of cyclical as we work through this work. There's always something new to uncover. Yeah, thank you. Meshayla, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a student, so please ignore my bed. But I'm a student, so obviously I'm like taking notes and like listening to everything you guys are saying. But in the group that we were in, Rachel Hicks was saying how she does 20 years of in-person event production facilitation, how she works on creating Black spaces that Black people actually want to be in, or BIPOC people actually want to be in. And I thought that was like, I thought that was really good. Like, I didn't grow up in America. I grew up somewhere else. So, like I was saying to my group, I call like America like the salt and pepper of racism. Like it's very original. Like it's very, very different for me. It's a very different experience. So when she said that, I thought that was really, really good, because a lot of people do the token thing of just putting the Black people in the spaces and like going, here, you're included. And we're like, okay, but like we don't really want to be there. But she does work like making sure like people are actually like supposed to be there, have something to contribute, have something to like actually like be productive in and like feel like they're a part of something. So not to call her out too much, but I thought that was really, really cool.
No, I appreciate that, Meshayla. And thinking about inclusion as it being intentional and thoughtful, and also considering how we dismantle dominant power structures to give access and control and power to historically marginalized groups, or the marginalized groups within your organization that historically have not have access to that power. So not just bringing folks into the room, but also adjusting the power structures where those brought into that space can actually impact change, and see that happen. So when Julia was talking, I was thinking about as you were sharing the makeup of your board and how it's important to have a majority where you don't just have 2 people of color who have no voting power and no power to actually make significant change within the organization, but so they have voting power and a majority in that space. Additional thoughts? Where are you in this journey, and what are your biggest challenges?
I'm happy to share. This is Bridget from the Community Foundation. So we are, I would say that our biggest challenge, or the challenge that I feel is kind of twofold. One, I think our staff individually have done a lot more work on their equity journey than our board of directors. And so I feel like there's this incongruence of education and level setting that needs to be addressed. And so I think just given turnover of board in terms of their term limits, that's natural that we're going to have new folks coming on, which is, I think, actually really obviously important. But that just requires, I think, this continual level setting. And so, Meshayla, to your point earlier, when you were kind of opening up the conversation, that this, so I think the challenge and opportunity for us as an organization is how do we so deeply root this equity work in everything we do in terms of onboarding staff, onboarding board members, that this is just a part of our shared language. This is a part of who we are as an organization. And so that it's not these like kind of one-off trainings or self-development work, but it's really like the framework of how we make decisions as organizations that aligns with our values. And so I think the continual puzzle for me is we're always having new people come into our organization. And so what are ways that we can support folks that are on the full spectrum of their own equity journey and have their own lived experiences? So I guess that's maybe a puzzle that we're puzzling through as a team.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Bridget. Is anyone else in a similar kind of space in their journey and willing to share? Yeah, Suzanne.
Oh, I raised my hand when you said similar space, and then you said willing to share. But yes, okay. Our issue is several years ago, we had people from the Montana Racial Equity Project come and give a training to our board. And now I'm the only board member that's still on the board, and I feel like I'm starting over. So similar to what Bridget shared, the nature of nonprofit boards is people cycle through. So how do we maintain a common experiential educational base? So right now I'm thinking, okay, an annual training, even if it's repetitive, so, it's a problem that we can solve. So I guess I'll just leave it there for now, but I'm open to other ideas from people who work in nonprofits when there is so much turnover. But where there's a will, there's a way. And so it's a matter of how many people in this room are committed to this. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Suzanne. And I'm going to bring us back into the slides because I think as we work through this kind of table here, it will kind of bring us closer potentially to answering some of those questions or kind of framing how we thoughtfully and intentionally integrate anti-racism, equity, and inclusion within an organization. So I kind of went into already the identity and mission, working together to build a common understanding of language within, your change makers united, and also within the organization as a whole, where everybody has a common understanding of anti-racism as it relates to your identity, as it relates to your mission. Now, diving into culture. Now, culture is something that we reference all the time, but it's something that often we can't quite give a detailed description of. So just to get it out of the way for defining and having common understanding of language, simply put, it's the spoken and unspoken rules, patterns of behavior, habits, norms, language, standards of quote unquote professionalism that manage manage our organization or that employees experience. If our mission is who we say we are, then our culture is what we do. They can be voiced and reinforced institutionally and interpersonally. They're dynamic and of course shape our perceptions, our behaviors, our understanding. This is where we want to really focus on examining white supremacy culture characteristics and other dominant culture norms. Naming dominant culture, white supremacy, power, and control is not in and of itself perpetuating racism. You can't change what you can't name. This is going to be another place where like measurement, because assessing your organizational culture as it stands now positions you to, and of course, integrating that with anti-racist and equity principles, it gives you a starting place to know what's working, what's not. There are standard ways that you can support all employees that continues to further equity, racial equity and inclusion. But with this specific lens of eliminating white supremacy culture. So this might look like going from celebrating things like perfectionism and the hustle and this sense of urgency. And I know that sense of urgency and quantity over quality is probably one of the biggest hurdles for nonprofits, right? Produce. We have to do this for the grant and people not being paid adequately, and burnout is just a norm within the nonprofit industry, right? So working from celebrating white supremacy culture characteristics to, right, you can't change what you can't name, acknowledging white supremacy culture characteristics, to addressing, to a full elimination. And that's a pretty small scale and it'll work in steps, but a way to envision a continuum of change. There's a quote that I want to read to you all. So let me pull it up here. And it's from Edgar Villanueva from his book, Decolonizing Wealth. And he says, we know what spices in organizations look like, what they feel like and function like when they are inspired by colonizers' principles of separation, competition, and exploitation. Think of those as white supremacy culture characteristics. How would they be different if they were based on principles like integration, interdependence, reciprocity, and relationship? And I think that that quote really gets at the core of the shift we're trying to make workplaces human and people focused. To do that, we have to address the systems of oppression that are prohibiting us from achieving that reality, right? Moving into program initiatives, and this is by no means like, you definitely start with identity and mission. You work into each of these. They can all be attacked and addressed at the same time, right? It's not necessarily, besides identifying your goals and your mission, how you integrate it, it is not that you have to do organizational culture first, then program initiatives, but there's ways to address all of those areas at one time. Within program initiatives, a goal of actualizing anti-racism might be that they fully embody anti-racist principles, right? You can find ways to engage members and staff in conversations that address the macro level distribution of power, as well as the privileges and unearned benefits of white privilege. And then, of course, perpetuating the need for education and training to understand the microaggressions to the macroaggressions that occur, especially, and we'll talk about the feel-good DEI and organizations who are like, we're just welcome, like, we are welcoming to all people. So how can this very broad, non-specific push for diversity negatively impact people of color? And what does it look like to fully embody anti-racism as a core principle as you build out program initiatives? Staffing patterns, usually that's folks' start and stop point, right? Diversity as a start and stop. We're like, okay, how do we recruit? How do we hire? We want to bring in more people of color with little to no attention to what are those conditions internally that need to be shifted: identity and mission, organizational cultures, systems of accountability, structure and constituency, to support bringing in people of color to the organization in a way where you can retain them and you're not perpetuating or causing even more harm. So thinking of kind of a continuum from staffing patterns, only white folks, to tokenization, a couple people of color, more specifically people of color you feel comfortable with, who are forced to assimilate within an organization, to maybe like a small percentage, and they're still probably having to assimilate, don't have any decision-making power, maybe they're only within lower levels within the organization and they're not in leadership roles, to actualizing anti-racism would look like having fully balanced staffing, and of course, methods of measurement for recruitment, retention, and promotion within your organization as it relates to communities of color. I think that within this, we also want to think about language. So job description is a great place to start. That provides an inherent advantage to white people for staffing positions. So of course, beyond having your EEOC compliant language about diversity and just listing the demographics that are covered under that, but think about having your anti-racism statement clearly expressed. And we'll also talk a little in a bit about that feel-good DEI and avoiding like, we just welcome all people and we love everybody, being very clear and explicit about what you hope to achieve. Another way to kind of represent and this value of equity and to break down barriers. And I've seen a lot of organizations do this already, which is to, if it's not fully necessary, to have some type of licensing, accept lived experiences and other experiences in addition to or in place of educational or college degree or bachelor's or what have you. Also looking at, are there specific places that you're placing your, job descriptions? Do you have you built relationships with communities of color and other marginalized communities? And are you sharing that knowledge and those opportunities within those places as well? So look at where you are advertising for open positions, who is seeing it, what relationships also have you built within that space? And I think this brings us into accountability. When we're thinking about accountability, we're looking at this push from, of course, no accountability or into, maybe, or there's only accountability to white folks within the organization, to actualizing or institutionalizing anti-racism. We look at a fully integrated approach to accountability. So these are accountability structures to people of color and other marginalized groups. This means that there is accountability for those who have been harmed or maybe expressed dissent, even when it's coming from the person of color that you have maybe deemed as unsafe, or they make you uncomfortable. Maybe they've challenged you a little bit more, you find them aggressive, whatever the variety of stereotypes that might be attributed to this person. Dissecting how you engage with people of color outside of your safe POC bubble is your personal work to do, right? Similar, and then when we're thinking about accountability, I'm really curious in the group if anyone has considered defining accountability. We hear it all the time. We need accountability, I need accountability, right? And we don't have a very clear way of defining this term. It's similar to culture. It's like we all know it, but we don't have a common understanding of what it is. Anyone have maybe a helpful frame, definition, understanding of accountability that they've used or are using? Oh, yes, I saw a hand raised.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how accountability takes different forms. Like if we're talking about organizations just being accountable to demonstrating commitment and priority, like that can be measured, right? It can be how, like, what's the budget for that look like? Is there a committee? How frequently does it meet? Who are you working with? Like there are actual metrics that is just on the like accountable to commitment, accountable to the mission, accountable to the values. And then there's additional layers of accountability, which is how are you accountable to implementing and acting on the things you learn? Like, what does your organization do when there is harm? What do you do when you're serving, like, let's say you're a health clinic and somebody comes and says, I had a bad experience, I felt marginalized here. Then it's like, well, the accountability isn't like, well, we have a DEI committee that meets once monthly and we've done 12 different trainings and all of our board members commit to DEI service. That's not accountability. That's deflection and escape. And so I think I'm thinking through the multiple layers of what accountability looks like at different points. I do think so many organizations want to just reach that first level of accountability and saying like, nope, this is a core part of it. But even like, I'll share my organization. Yeah, it's a core part, but we also canceled the past 2 DEI committee meetings. And, and I'm like, well, is that accountability? Because I don't think so. But we say that we're accountable because we have these standing meetings and we dedicate resources and time. So probably more questions than answers there, but that's where my head is.
No, thanks, Angelina. I really appreciate that breakdown. Oh, Kavayota.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Angelina had to say. And it makes me harken back to kind of where I always end up in discussions around this issue is that we're dealing with both the macro and the microcosm of all of this, right? So if someone comes to my clinic and says I felt marginalized, it's the individual that they're speaking to in that moment that has to be accountable for their behavior within the mission that we as the organization have set up. So to a great extent, your organization's accountability is only as good as the accountability of the individual who's dealing in that specific moment with a person who comes to you in good faith and wants to share with you that this has been their experience. And I think that's both the wonderfulness of it and the difficulty of it, because we're we're about changing systems, but we're also about changing individual hearts. And I think we have to flank that issue from both of those sides and change institutions so that they, from the top down, can help change hearts and support the hearts that are trying to change. So I just really appreciated all the things you had to say, and I wanted to bring it, kind of remind us that it also happens one heart at a time, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Keva. I think and one of the core pieces that you shared there is how impactful the institutional change has on individuals. And when I'm thinking about accountability, I'm also wondering about, as an organization, to your community, into the communities that maybe you want to join your organization or engage in your programs, your initiatives, or your services. Sometimes institutions in your position have relationships with Black, Indigenous, people of color with whom you feel very comfortable with. And those kinds of relationships often or sometimes don't lead to authentic and frank feedback. And so thinking about accountability in terms of what do we do when we hear the hard things from the people we didn't really want to hear it from, or the people that I can feel the shame bubbling when they tell me, or the guilt, or all the emotions that come up when we feel like we were wrong, right? And so being open to accountability from all people of color, not just the ones you deemed safe. I think accountability it was brought up a lot of times, like, we're a white-led org, what do we do? Oh my gosh, I don't know, there's no people of color. But when we're thinking about white supremacy and how it's not by accident that a large portion of us live in Montana and the organizations are predominantly white, that is not by accident, that is by design, right? So as an organization, in terms of accountability to the history of your existence in this state, in this country, is recognizing that you have a history of white dominance. And as such, you can't really decide for yourselves when you have become an anti-racist organization. And so accountability is really making yourselves accountable to the historic targets of oppression, of historically marginalized, disenfranchised people. And of course, weaving that into not just the people you feel comfortable hearing the hard things from, right? And so really, I think accountability in looking at identity and mission as well is reckoning with the creation of your organization, the history of your organization, and how might that in and of itself impact whether or not communities of color want to engage with you or your work. For the sake of time, I'm gonna run through structure and constituency as well. A lot of the same thought processes here, to not start and stop with diversity, recognizing that structures and systems are designed to maintain white power and control. And so we want to think of moving towards anti-racism as seeing that your systems are designed to maintain that power, to work to examining that. What does it mean? What does it look like? Measuring those pieces, to undermining the structures that maintain white power and control, to a full restructuring of those power structures. And again, accountability is weaved in all of these pieces as to know when we've gotten closer to actualizing anti-racism within the organization. And then throughout all of these pieces, more important than anything, of course, is measurement, measurement, measurement. And this looks in a lot of different ways. Doesn't always just look like surveying your population. This looks like review or auditing your materials, right? So going through or you definitely want to have an outside consultant go through and do an audit of your materials to see how they align with anti-racist and equity principles. Just to work through our avoid the feel-good DEI traps. So what is feel-good DEI? These are statements that imply, we're welcoming for all and we value the inherent dignity of everybody, and this is what we do all the time, right? It's as if you have achieved inclusion and equity already. And as we've talked about today, as folks brought up, as if it's ever anything to fully achieve, right? It is a lived value, something we're trying to strive for at all times. Diversity for diversity's sake, starting and stopping at diversity, leading to tokenism and assimilation. We value diversity of thought. So again, leaning into how do we make white folks the most comfortable? Where do we feel comfortable? Well, we feel comfortable to just talk about, it's just diversity of thought, and we don't have to actually challenge any white supremacy ideology or power structures that currently exist. colorblind racism or multicultural racism. These are kind of like deeply tied into that like pretty fun, feel good inclusion and equity statements. But thinking about these two forms of racism, first, like we don't see color. That's why we value probably a diversity of thought. We don't see color. This isn't an issue here because we don't have people of color in this room. And even if we did, it doesn't matter if you're black, red, purple, green. We still value all humans without recognizing that my color is it is made up, that I am black, that you are white, but it is a social reality, and it has very real harmful and violent implications in my life. Multicultural racism is we value LGBT plus, and we value people of color, and we value folks with, and not honing in on the specific ways that oppression impacts each specific group, and having an analysis, an intersectional analysis within that. So again, centering anti-racism and seeing how someone who is Black, queer, trans is going to be treated versus me as a cis Black woman, right? But what we recognize is colorblind racism, multicultural racism often overlap within orgs, and they perpetuate this equality first agenda. Like everybody deserves to be treated equally, and the assumption that everybody is deserving of all the same things, but without recognizing that unbalanced conditions are needed to dismantle oppressive barriers that have historically created those unbalanced conditions for dominant cultures and people. Our experience, my experience really shows me and other consultants in this work that when you encourage this egalitarian approach to DEI, the structures and the culture will continue to maintain white power and white dominance. And because of this, the environment will never breed inclusive behaviors, right? It will always breed non-inclusive behaviors, a lack of willingness to participate in anti-racist efforts because we don't see color. Race isn't an issue. I don't even want to have to get engaged in this work because I don't think it's a problem. And it'll also perpetuate a feeling of distrust and a lack of belonging amongst the communities of color that you're hoping to integrate. There's a lot of different ways that you can impact this work, and I'd love, chance to talk more about it. And one of those ways, of course, you can't change what you can't name, the theme of today, is to either connect with me via email and talk about some of the ways that you can institutionalize anti-racism within your organization, like specific strategies that you can implement, interested in audits, assessments, but namely, and I think that Jill is going to share this in the chat, if you fill out this Google form and share your email, you can sign up for a newsletter. It's our CoEquity quarterlies where we send out resources, just staying in the know of the trends and the top things happening within anti-racism, readings that are top of mind, other resources, videos, podcasts, things of that sort. So would love to stay connected in any of the many ways. The Google form is one of those ways as well. And so thank you all so much for taking the time today. Came right up on the hour, but Jill follows up with a feedback form. And so if you have questions or follow up, that'd be a great place to do that.